I was struck by something that the AG talked about at the beginning of his statement, saying that Taylor's death is undisputably a terrible tragedy. But the law, the criminal law, is not always able to adequately respond to tragedy. As a man of the law yourself, Keir, did the AG do his job properly here?
Well, he certainly looked earnest. He certainly looked pained. He certainly, when he described the conversation with the family members, I'm sure that it was a very hard conversation. And there are many areas where the law is simply inadequate. Even, we all have to remember, of course, that even if the grand jury had determined to charge one of the other two officers, those charges would not bring Breonna Taylor back to us. Her loss is, of course, is tragic. There are, of course, limits to what the law can do. I think he was speaking a general truth about the law in this regard. Now, we don't know, and I guess your question was, did he do everything right? Did he do his job correctly? We have heard his side we've heard his presentation of what the grand jury has heard and their decision. That's why we have criminal trials. That's why we have trials for Mr. Hankinson. The evidence will be presented in court. Another jury will decide whether or not those charges were appropriate. Because there aren't charges that have been brought against the remaining two officers, Mattingly and Cosgrove, we'll have to wait and see whether there's another process available to us to review that evidence, to see if there was something that was missed or inappropriate. And of course, we also have to remember that there is a federal investigation pending as well.
Right. He mentioned that. We did learn a lot of new things about this case from the AG today. He said, number one, what has been widely described as a no-knock warrant was indeed not a no-knock warrant. He said they were able to corroborate the officers' position that they had announced themselves. They found a witness, a citizen, he said, who did hear the officers announce themselves as police. He said that Mattingly and Cosgrove were justified in returning fire after being fired on by Kenneth Walker. So some of what we heard from the AG today doesn't add up with some of what has been reported. Part of it is, sometimes investigations bring up different facts. There was a reporter who actually asked him and said, we've interviewed a lot of people in that apartment complex ourselves, and we weren't able to find anyone, maybe save one person, that said they heard the police announce themselves. Is that sufficient? So at what point, Keir, is the evidence that was brought to the grand jury, who gets to decide if that was a sufficient announcement?
Right. So this is why jury trials become so important, why it's so important to have witnesses in the courtroom under examination, under cross-examination. Effectively, if I understand the facts, Mr. Walker, Breonna Taylor's boyfriend, said that there was no announcement by the police. So you have one witness saying that. You have the police officers, if I understood correctly what the Attorney General said, saying that they did knock and announce. And you have this third witness, a third party, this civilian witness outside saying that he or she heard also the police knock and announce. Credibility determinations are made in court and, at a trial. Now, whether or not that particular issue will come up and will be part of the testimony in Mr. Hankinson's trial, because he was charged with that wantonness crime. Whether we'll see that evidence at a trial, it's possible we will. But when you have conflicting testimony like this, as a general matter, this is why we have courtrooms that requires non-hearsay testimony so that jurors can assess the credibility and decide. A jury could decide that what Mr. Walker's saying is true and what the police and the civilian witness saying is incorrect. That a jury, after hearing the testimony, could conclude exactly the opposite, that the civilian witness and the police were correct and Mr. Walker was incorrect. But these determinations, the Attorney General, I think you can infer that they concluded that the civilian witness and the police were telling the correct version of events, that the police knocked and announced. And I think that is one of the facts that it supports the Attorney General's determination that the officers were justified in returning fire when they were inside the apartment.
That does seem to be a crucial piece of it. Jericka, I want to turn to you now because you are on the ground there in Louisville. As we know, emotions over this case are running very high. Now that the indictment has been handed down, one that's clearly disappointing to many people there on the streets in Louisville, how are they reacting to the announcement? I mean, we heard the Attorney General speak for quite a while. Clearly, he wanted to diffuse the situation, diffuse expectations. How were his words taken?
People were angry. They were crying. They were upset, frustrated, disappointed. They expected more. Tamika Mallory, who's with the group Until Justice, they've been camped out here since May. They decided to sort of live here permanently, very much in the community. And one of the things she said before the announcement, as she was tearing up, is, I just have a good feeling today. I have a feeling that, you know, justice will be served and we're going to get some good news. That was not the news that they were expecting. Breonna Taylor's mother, her two attorneys, said with us last week when we sat down with them that they were hoping for at least second-degree manslaughter charges, which are obviously much more heavier than the wanton, the wanton endangerment first degree, which could be 1 to 5 years if convicted. They were hoping for second-degree manslaughter. But I want to point out a couple of highlights to me in listening to that almost hour-long news conference. It was interesting that at the very beginning, Attorney General Daniel Cameron made the statement about not having a lot of the evidence, not having a camera, only having the cameras of the people that arrived after everything was finished, and really relying on these ballistic reports to show what happened. He said at least 3 times that Mattingly and Cosgrove were justified. Let me be clear, he said. Let me say that again. He talked about what he said were the facts and the evidence that pointed to what they did is what one would expect an officer to do if they were fired upon. Something else that I thought was interesting and sort of struck me was the question about how the African-American community is taking this news. And this is the first time that we saw him really sort of pause and show emotion. He said, I certainly understand the pain. I understand that as a black man, how painful this is. He said, my heart breaks for the loss of Miss Taylor. And then he went on to say, I think about my mother. And he kind of paused, and if she lost her child. So even though he talked about how it is important for him as the Kentucky Attorney General to separate emotion and only rely on the facts and only rely on the evidence, it was a moment where we saw him sort of get emotional about putting himself in Breonna Taylor's mother's shoes. Also, when asked about the makeup of his team, which he said comprised of 200 years of experience, the racial makeup of his team, he said, quote, I'm a black man. He said, I'm black, so I speak for the entire department. A number of things that happened here that I think for the first time we really did get a chance to hear from him. I can tell you just in the last month or two, calling that office sometimes several times a day to see if there was any update or question, information, reporting, rumors that had been circulating. I was kind of surprised to hear him open up, and also shocked to hear that he took as many questions as he did, just because the office has been so tight-lipped about this case. But he answered, questions for at least a half hour or so, and encouraged everyone to sort of come together. He acknowledged that there are problems right now. He acknowledged that people are frustrated and upset, but he also said he wants to do more. He talked about joining or starting this task force to look at how they were going to operate when warrants are placed. So best practices for warrants, excuse me. So it will be interesting to see what happens tonight and to get a chance to speak with some of the people who, again, have been out here more than 100 days here in Jefferson Square. But a lot was covered, as you mentioned. A lot was said that we didn't necessarily hear about up until today.
Yes, and I do want to go back to that moment that you mentioned where we did see him almost get emotional. I mean, my monitor is not the best here. I can't quite tell if, he had tears in his eyes, but that was sort of unexpected from an attorney general who had been very much by the book and very much, following the facts. And it shows that he also understands how high emotions are running there in Louisville over this case. It shows that he is hoping to sort of bridge that and that he understands that these charges are disappointing to a lot of people there.
Yeah. I also thought it was interesting that he mentioned the fact that there was no friendly fire. I know there were reports that possibly Mattingly was hit by an officer's gun, and he made it clear that he said Walker is the one who had the 9mm handgun. Based on the ballistic reports, that was the bullet that did hit Mattingly, which prompted him to fire the shots. And then just the idea that Mattingly fired 6 shots. Cosgrove, they said, fired 16 shots, and that it was Cosgrove's one of the shots fired at Breonna that actually killed her. He also made a point to mention that the fatal shot, he said, would have killed Breonna Taylor in a matter of minutes, which also speaks to there being reports about whether or not an aid could have been administered to Breonna Taylor much sooner. So, again, a lot of questions have been answered, but I still feel as though we have yet to speak to Breonna Taylor's family about their reaction to the news and their perception of the conversation that they had with Kentucky Attorney General Daniel Cameron. He did address that at the end. Someone asked him, can you talk about the conversation that you had with Ms. Tamika Palmer? And he said it was a hard conversation. He maintained that, he's sorry for the loss, but stood, he never wavered from the point that he was making about this being a case that should be driven by facts and evidence. But, acknowledging, as many people have, that your heart breaks for somebody like Tamika Palmer.
Yeah, and that was clearly a difficult conversation that he had with the family. He made that clear. Keir, I want to get back to the fact of negligence, right? I mean, he made a point, as Jericka just said, of saying several times that the officers were justified, Mattingly and Cosgrove were justified in returning fire when Kenneth Walker shot them. But if we back up and we talk about the information that led to the warrant in the first place, they had faulty information. They shouldn't have been there in the first place. So is anybody responsible for that? Does the department hold some liability here in what resulted in a wrongful death?
Right. So one of the things that the Attorney General said early in the conference was that the 3 officers we were speaking about today did not have a role in putting together that search warrant, that they were brought in to the execution team after that warrant was obtained by a prior team, and that there was a separate investigation into that. Those are very good questions. If there were misstatements that were made, or even worse, false statements that were made in connection with that application of that for that search warrant, then yes, the folks who did it could potentially have legal exposure, and certainly the state of Kentucky or the government of Kentucky could have liability as well, monetary liability for this. I don't know whether or not that was a part of the settlement that the Taylor family has already entered. I don't know whether it was simply limited to her homicide, but these are open questions. That's a great question, Tanya.
And so are these potential next steps then in the case for Breonna Taylor's family if they want to continue, pushing for justice? Like you said, they've had a civil settlement, but if they would like to, hold the department responsible, are there next steps?
Well, there are potentially different theories of liability that they could explore and that they could follow up on. One is there a problem with the search warrant? If that wasn't already part of the settlement, it may very well have been. The federal investigation into the shooting itself. Remember, there is a potential criminal civil rights federal investigation now that the state has apparently declined to seek criminal charges against Mattingly and Cosgrove. The feds could still take another look at this. One of the questions in the conference was, if Mr. Walker, the boyfriend, was the one who fired the shot, but Breonna Taylor was of the two of them was the only one to be struck by bullets, although they would be justified to return fire, having been fired upon. We're getting into the nitty-gritty here, but where were Mr. Walker and Ms. Taylor? Where were they positioned? Were they so close to each other that an officer, under the circumstances that they were returning fire, wouldn't be able to effectively be able to miss? Or was this just a terrible mistake? It's obviously a tragedy. But the Attorney General gave us a preview, but he didn't give us all of the details, in particular the ballistics details.
Mm-hmm. So, Jericka, according to what we heard the Attorney General talk about some of the details of the investigation, he says the officers did not use a no-knock warrant. So we've seen the no-knock warrant, come under fire as a result of this case. In fact, I do believe that it is one of the changes that are being implemented to the Louisville Police Department as a result of the civil lawsuit. Is this likely to impact any of those changes?
Well, as you mentioned, the changes have been made through Breonna's law. Officers are expected to have those body cameras on at all times, and also there are no-knock warrants. So I don't know that there's any more changes that can come from that. But going back to the charges, I do want to say that the Attorney General, when asked, did you present the grand jury with other charges, be it manslaughter, be it reckless homicide, on top of the wanton endangerment? And his response was that they walked the grand jury through every homicide offense and ultimately let the grand jury make the decision based on the information that they provided. Also, he called off, or not off, but he mentioned that celebrities and influencers and people who are not from this area will tell you how to feel. He's talking to the people of Louisville, and he said that it is important to basically not listen to them because we know our community. We know that we're better than going out and promoting violence, et cetera, et cetera. It's just interesting that he would mention that because this case has gotten so much attention worldwide, from Oprah Winfrey, Alicia Keys, rapper Common. The list goes on and on of people who've either been here on the ground or who have put their support behind justice for Breonna Taylor. And I just saw shortly before the announcement, Tamika Mallory, who we talked about before, who's with the Group for Justice, said if there are no indictments today, we need to protest for Breonna all over the world. So we will monitor, of course, situations here in Louisville, but it will be interesting to see what happens in some of these other big cities who've seen cases like this or who have been very active when it comes to protests. Excuse me, I'm looking off to the side because there's a car that just came on near the sidewalk, and we're always sort of watching ourselves around here. But long story short, I just want to say that what happened today, I think we will see an impact, whether it be from celebrities who are going to speak out about their thoughts because they spoke out before this decision, and other communities who've also been promoting justice in the case of African Americans in particularly.
All right, Jericka Duncan and Keir Dougall, thanks to both of you.